You will never amount to anything if you turn your back on Vance Porcelain, Eleanor. You belong here, molding clay, not chasing whatever this is." The words, sharp as shards of bisque, echoed in the cavernous, dust-mote-danced light of the studio, sealing her fate. Eleanor clutched the small porcelain robin in her hand. Its cool weight a familiar comfort, a familiar chain. Her mother's face, etched with a disappointment far older than this conversation, was the last thing she saw before she walked out. The heavy oak door of the family estate closing behind her, like the final, resounding chord of a life she was leaving behind. The scent of damp clay and wood smoke clung to her clothes, a ghost she couldn't shake. Years later, the scent is replaced by the crisp, clean air of a high-rise studio overlooking a city skyline that glittered like scattered diamonds. The robin sits on her desk, its intricate painting catching the afternoon light. It had traveled with her, a silent witness. She hadn't gone to a husband's office, not in the way her mother might have imagined. She'd gone to the office of her own ambition, built stone by careful stone, design by painstaking design. In the metaphorical desk drawer of that new life, she'd found not just success, but resilience, a clear vision, and a quiet strength she never knew the porcelain robin, nor the Vance legacy, could provide. She'd built something entirely her own. The email arrived just moments ago, stark white on the screen. An invitation, a wedding. Her sister Clara, at the estate she swore she'd never set foot in again. Her fingers traced the cool, glazed surface of the robin. The past she had meticulously packed away was now demanding her return, pulling at the threads of a life she thought was entirely her own. The scent of clay seemed, for a moment, to drift in on the city air. She had to go back. Eleanor leaned her forehead against the cool train window, watching the blur of green turn slowly to familiar, rolling hills. Each mile marker was a tiny pinprick closer to the source of an ache that had lived quiet, but persistent, beneath the surface of her carefully constructed life. The rejection had been absolute. Not just a disagreement about career choices, but a fundamental dismissal of her vision, her modern designs, her desire to expand beyond the traditional, ornate pieces Vance Porcelain was known for. All were seen as a betrayal of the family's 100-year legacy. Her mother, Beatrice, a woman whose posture was as rigid as fired stoneware, had delivered the ultimatum with chilling calm. "Vance Porcelain is who we are, Eleanor. It's not a stepping stone, it's a commitment. If you can't commit to it wholly, if you think you can simply cherry-pick the parts you like and discard the rest, then you don't belong here," Eleanor had argued, her voice trembling not just with anger, but with a deep, soul-deep hurt. She loved Vance Porcelain. She loved the history, the feel of the clay, the magic of the kiln. But she also saw its stagnation, its refusal to adapt, its slow decline in a changing market. She had ideas, vibrant, modern ideas that honored the craft while breathing new life into it. She wanted to create sculptural, minimalist pieces, explore new glazes, collaborate with contemporary artists. Her mother saw it as desecration. The robin. She had brought it with her that day, planning to show her mother a small, personal project she'd completed, a modern take on a classic Vance motif. It was a simple, unglazed form, but with a fluidity and movement unlike anything the studio typically produced. Beatrice hadn't even looked at it. "That bauble," she'd said, her lip curling slightly. "That's not Vance work. That's whimsy." Eleanor remembered the sting, hotter than any kiln. That bauble was the physical embodiment of her passion, her attempt to bridge tradition and innovation. It wasn't just a piece of clay, it was a piece of her heart. The porcelain robin she now carried, the one on her desk, was the original heirloom robin, passed down through generations. It felt impossibly heavy now. She had left that day with nothing but a small suitcase. And the robin. No tearful goodbyes, just the quiet, resolute click of the gate behind her. She'd moved to the city, started small, selling her unique, modern ceramic pieces at local markets. It was hard, lonely work. There were nights she ate ramen noodles for dinner and doubted everything, but she kept working, kept experimenting, kept refining her craft, always with the robin nearby. Slowly, painstakingly, she built a name for herself. Her designs were featured in magazines. She landed commissions. Her online shop flourished. She called her business Ember and Clay, a subtle nod to the fire and earth of her origins, but distinctively her own. She had proven her mother wrong, not out of spite, but out of necessity. She had to build a life where her creativity wasn't stifled. Then came the invitation. Clara's wedding. Clara, her younger sister, sweet, unassuming Clara, who had always seemed content to stay within the familiar confines of the estate, helping in the studio, mastering the traditional glazing techniques. Eleanor and Clara had been close growing up, sharing secrets under the eaves of their old house, dreaming of futures that felt impossibly distant. Their relationship had frayed after Eleanor left, strained by distance and the unspoken tension of her departure. Clara's occasional hesitant phone calls had been polite, surface level. Receiving the invitation felt like a physical jolt. It wasn't just a wedding, it was a summons back to the place of her deepest wound. Could she face her mother, her siblings, the house itself, which held so many ghosts? What would they say? Had anything changed? Or would she find the same judgment, the same disapproval waiting for her? She hesitated for days. The invitation sat on her desk, a stark white square against the warm wood. She looked at the robin. It seemed to be urging her, not back to the past, but towards a resolution. This wasn't just about the wedding. It was about confronting the past, so she could fully inhabit her future. She wouldn't be returning as the defeated daughter, but as Eleanor Vance, founder of Ember and Clay. The thought gave her a fragile shield of courage. She booked the train ticket. The click of the confirmation email, echoing the click of the gate all those years ago. This time, she was walking towards the closing door. Just before we dive back in, let me know where you're listening from tonight. I love seeing the map light up. She packed light, but carefully. A few simple dresses, comfortable shoes for navigating the uneven stone paths of the estate, and tucked carefully into her bag, the heirloom porcelain robin. Its familiar weight was both a comfort and a challenge. It represented the history she was returning to, but also the resilience she had found away from it. She thought about the intricate, almost invisible cracks beneath its glaze, a reminder that even the most perfect surfaces can hide imperfections. As the train chugged along, she closed her eyes, the rhythmic click-clack of the wheels a soothing counterpoint to the nervous flutter in her stomach. She pictured the estate, the sweeping driveway lined with ancient oaks, the imposing, slightly melancholic gray stone house, the separate, smaller building that housed the studio, smelling faintly of damp earth and creativity. She remembered the feeling of clay between her fingers, the focused quiet of the studio, the thrill of opening the kiln after a firing. These were the good memories, the ones she had allowed herself to keep. But she also remembered the tension, the unspoken expectations, the suffocating weight of tradition. The way her brother, Thomas, the eldest, had effortlessly slipped into his role as heir apparent, his traditional designs praised, while hers were subtly, and not so subtly, dismissed. The way her sister, Clara, had seemed content to live in the shadow of their mother's formidable presence. And her mother, always judging, always evaluating, always finding her wanting. She had left to find air, to find space to breathe and create. She had found it in abundance, but the wound hadn't fully healed. It remained a tender spot, easily bruised by a careless word or a painful memory. Going back felt like deliberately pressing on that bruise. Why was she doing this? For Clara, of course. She loved her sister and wanted to be there for her on her wedding day. But it was more than that. It was a need to face the past on her own terms, to show them who she had become. not defiantly, but simply honestly, to prove, perhaps only to herself, that her path had been valid, necessary. The train slowed, pulling into the small, familiar station. The air felt different here, cleaner, cooler, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. It smelled like home, and like exile. Stepping onto the platform, she felt a wave of vertigo. She was here. There was no turning back. The past was waiting, not just in the old house, but within her, stirring from its uneasy sleep. She took a deep breath. The porcelain robin nestled in her bag, a small, hard anchor. It was time to face the music. A taxi, smelling faintly of stale cigarettes and pine air freshener, bumped along the familiar country roads. Eleanor watched the landscape unfold. A tapestry of rolling hills, stone walls, and ancient trees. Nothing had changed, and yet everything felt profoundly different. The estate gates, framed by overgrown hedges, loomed ahead. The driver pulled up the long, winding driveway, the gravel crunching under the tires. The house stood just as she remembered it, grand, slightly melancholic, its grey stone walls softened by clinging ivy. Smoke curled lazily from one of the chimneys. It looked like a painting, serene and timeless, but she knew the currents that ran beneath the surface. The taxi stopped, and for a moment, Eleanor just sat, hand on the door handle, heart hammering against her ribs. This was it. The point of no return. She took another deep breath, straightened her shoulders, and opened the door. Stepping out onto the gravel felt like stepping onto a stage. The air was cool and crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. It was the smell of her childhood, a smell that simultaneously comforted and unsettled her. She retrieved her suitcase, the familiar weight grounding her slightly. The front door opened before she even reached the steps. Her mother stood in the doorway, a figure sculpted from granite and disapproval. Beatrice Vance. She hadn't changed. Her silver hair was pulled back in a severe bun, her posture ramrod straight, her eyes the color of glacial ice, fixed on Eleanor. "Eleanor?" her mother said, her voice flat, devoid of warmth. It wasn't a welcome, just a simple acknowledgement of her presence. "Mother," Eleanor replied, keeping her voice steady, neutral. Behind Beatrice, her brother, Thomas, appeared. Thomas. He looked older, heavier, a little more lined around the eyes. He ran the business now, the traditional heart of Vance Porcelain beating under his direction. His expression was a mixture of surprise and guarded curiosity. "Eleanor, is that really you?" he asked, a hint of genuine shock in his voice. "It's me, Thomas," she said, a small, hesitant smile touching her lips. Then Clara emerged, pushing past Thomas, her face lighting up with a genuine, unadulterated joy that melted some of the ice in Eleanor's chest. "LL, you came." Clara rushed forward, throwing her arms around Eleanor in a tight hug. Eleanor hugged her back, burying her face in her sister's hair, breathing in the familiar scent of lavender and wood smoke. This was why she was here. For Clara. "Of course I came, Lou," Eleanor said, using her old nickname for Clara. Wouldn't miss it. Clara pulled back, her eyes scanning Eleanor, taking in her city clothes. Her confident bearing. "You look amazing, Ella." "Different." Beatrice cleared her throat, a soft, pointed sound that cut through the moment. "Don't just stand on the doorstep. Come in, Eleanor. It's getting cold." Eleanor followed them into the house. The air inside was cool and still, smelling of old wood, beeswax polish, and something else, something faintly metallic, like the kilns. The grand hall was just as she remembered it, lined with portraits of stern-faced Vance ancestors and shelves displaying generations of Vance porcelain, ornate vases, delicate figurines, imposing platters. Her mother's collection. "Your old room is ready," Beatrice said, leading the way up the grand staircase. "It's been unused for some time." Unused. An empty space left behind, a testament to her absence. Her childhood bedroom was a time capsule. The same floral wallpaper, the same worn rug, the same view of the sprawling grounds. a small, unglazed clay bird she had made as a child sat on the windowsill. "It's exactly the same," Eleanor murmured, a wave of nostalgia and sadness washing over her. "We didn't see the need to change it," Beatrice said, her tone unreadable. Eleanor put her suitcase on the bed. The robin, still tucked inside, felt like a hidden secret. "So," Thomas said, leaning against the doorframe, arms crossed. "The prodigal daughter returns. Heard you made a name for yourself in the city. Something about modern art." There it was. The subtle jab. Her whimsy elevated to modern art, but still outside the realm of real Vance work. "I started a ceramics business," Eleanor said, keeping her voice even, ember and clay. "We focus on contemporary design, functional art pieces." Thomas raised an eyebrow. "Ember and clay, catchy. Doing well, are you?" "We are," Eleanor confirmed, a quiet confidence in her voice. "We recently landed a major contract with a national home goods chain and a gallery show in New York next spring." Silence. Heavy, thick silence. Beatrice's expression remained impassive, but Eleanor saw a flicker in her eyes, something unreadable. Thomas uncrossed his arms, his posture shifting slightly. Clara's eyes widened. "A national chain? New York gallery?" Thomas repeated, a note of genuine surprise replacing the sarcasm. "Yes," Eleanor said simply. This was the jaw-drop moment. They had clearly pictured her struggling, perhaps working a menial job, regretting her decision to leave. They hadn't expected her to thrive, to build something significant on her own terms. "That's impressive, Eleanor," Beatrice said, the words delivered grudgingly, as if forced through clenched teeth. "Thank you, Mother," Eleanor replied. It wasn't the validation she craved, but it was acknowledgement. It was a start. "We should, talk about the wedding arrangements," Thomas said, clearing his throat, shifting the subject away from Eleanor's success. "Clara, did you show Eleanor the seating chart?" The conversation moved to wedding logistics, a safe, neutral ground, but the air in the room had shifted. Eleanor wasn't just the daughter who had left. She was a successful businesswoman who had built her own empire outside the Vance walls. Her return wasn't just personal, it had implications for the family legacy, a legacy they had assumed was solely theirs to control. As the afternoon wore on, the initial awkwardness began to dissipate, replaced by the complex, familiar dynamics of family. There were strained smiles, carefully worded questions that hinted at underlying curiosity or judgment, and moments of genuine connection, mostly with Clara, Eleanor unpacked, placing the porcelain robin on the bedside table. It seemed to watch her, a silent observer in this familiar, yet alien room. She walked through the house later, a ghost in her own past. The scent of the kilns drew her towards the studio. The heavy door creaked open. Inside, the familiar scent of clay, glaze, and heat washed over her. Shelves were lined with pieces in various stages of completion, all in the traditional Vance style. Intricate floral patterns, delicate handles, classic forms. Thomas's work was prominent, solid and skilled, but lacking the spark, the innovation she felt the business desperately needed. She ran a hand over a cool, finished vase. It was beautiful, technically perfect, but felt lifeless. Where was the joy, the experimentation? Had the focus on tradition suffocated the artistry? She found her mother in her small office off the studio, hunched over ledgers, her brow furrowed. The office felt smaller, dustier than she remembered. The air was thick with the smell of old paper and worry. "Mother," Eleanor said softly. Beatrice looked up, her expression hardening slightly. "Eleanor, I thought you were resting." "I wanted to see the studio," Eleanor replied. "It's much the same. Tradition is the backbone of Vance porcelain," Beatrice said, her voice firm. "It's what sets us apart." "But is tradition enough?" Eleanor ventured gently. "The market has changed. People are looking for different things." Beatrice's eyes narrowed. "And you believe you know what people are looking for?" having abandoned the very foundation of this craft. The familiar wall went up, the old wound throbbed. "I built a successful business," Eleanor said, her voice regaining some of its earlier confidence. "By understanding what people want now, a business built on whimsy," Beatrice scoffed. Eleanor felt a flash of the old anger. "It's not whimsy, Mother. It's design, innovation. It's about respecting the craft while allowing it to evolve. Evolution can dilute the essence," Beatrice said, turning back to her ledgers. The conversation clearly over. Eleanor stood there for a moment, the scent of old paper and unspoken conflict heavy in the air. She looked at the framed photograph on Beatrice's desk. A younger Beatrice, smiling, standing next to a man Eleanor vaguely remembered as her grandfather in front of a freshly fired kiln. A sense of continuity, a legacy, but also a sense of being trapped by it. Back in her room, the porcelain robin seemed to gleam faintly in the fading light. It wasn't just an heirloom. It was a symbol of this complex, fragile family history. She picked it up, turning it over in her hands. Beneath the glaze, she could just make out the faint lines of the intricate, almost hidden pattern painted on its base. She'd never noticed it before. It was too fine, too delicate to be seen easily. What did it mean? Was it just decoration, or something more? The first night back was restless. The old house creaked and settled around her, each sound a whisper of the past. She felt like a stranger in a familiar land, her presence disrupting the quiet rhythm of the estate. Tomorrow, the wedding guests would start arriving, bringing with them more eyes, more questions, more potential for tension. The gentle unraveling had begun. If you're enjoying this gentle unraveling, tap subscribe. Tomorrow's chapter is one you won't want to miss. The next few days were a blur of pre-wedding activity. Relatives arrived, filling the old house with a chaotic energy that was both overwhelming and strangely comforting. There were aunts who pinched her cheek and asked if she was finally settling down, cousins who were overly solicitous about her little city business, and family friends who remembered her only as the rebellious teenager who had fled the nest. The tension, though often hidden beneath a veneer of wedding cheer, was palpable. It swirled around Eleanor like a fine dust, catching in her throat. Every conversation felt like a subtle interrogation or a veiled judgment. She was the outsider, the one who had broken rank, who had chosen a different path. The rehearsal dinner was held in the main dining room, a grand space usually reserved for holidays. The long mahogany table was laden with food, the air thick with the clatter of silverware and the murmur of conversation. Eleanor sat between Clara's fiancé, a kind but quiet man named Daniel, and an elderly aunt who insisted on telling her stories about Beatrice's childhood, painting a picture of a young woman already burdened by expectation. Beatrice sat at the head of the table, a regal presence in a deep emerald dress. She directed the flow of the meal, her eyes missing nothing. Thomas was seated opposite her, discussing the intricacies of kiln firing with an uncle who owned a pottery supply store. The world of Vance porcelain dominated the conversation, a constant reminder of the life Eleanor had left. Someone asked Thomas about a recent downturn in sales. Thomas sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It's the market, you know. People aren't buying traditional pieces like they used to. We're trying new marketing strategies." But he trailed off, frustration evident in his voice. An opening. Eleanor hesitated for a moment, then spoke up. "Have you considered exploring online platforms more aggressively, beyond just a basic website? Instagram, Pinterest, showcasing the process, the history, but also the versatility of the pieces in modern settings." All eyes turned to her. Thomas looked surprised, then skeptical. Beatrice's expression was carefully neutral, but her jaw tightened imperceptibly. "We have a website, Eleanor," Thomas said, a slight edge to his voice, "and a Facebook page. We post photos." "That's a start," Eleanor said gently. "But it's about engagement, building a community, telling the story of the clay, the artist, the piece, partnering with interior designers, lifestyle bloggers." She was speaking from experience, from the strategies that had made Ember and Clay successful. That sounds like a lot of work, Beatrice said, her voice cool and rather unconventional. It's the reality of the modern market, Mother, Eleanor said, meeting her gaze. Tradition is valuable, but if it doesn't connect with contemporary life, it becomes a museum piece, not a thriving business. A ripple of uncomfortable silence spread through the table. The elephant in the room had been acknowledged. Eleanor's success was built on embracing the unconventional, on connecting tradition with contemporary tastes. It was the very thing they had rejected her for. Later that evening, after the guests had dispersed, Eleanor found herself wandering into the empty studio. The air was cool and quiet, filled with the ghosts of countless hours spent working here. She ran her hand over the familiar surfaces, the worn wooden workbenches, the cool metal of the tools, the rough texture of unfired clay. She spotted the heirloom robin on a shelf, placed there during the day by someone, perhaps Clara, along with other family photographs and mementos gathered for the wedding. It sat amongst a collection of small, traditional Vance figurines, plump cherubs, delicate flowers. The robin, with its simple, elegant form and subtle, almost invisible pattern on its base, felt out of place. She picked it up again, turning it in her hands. The hidden pattern seemed to beckon, a secret waiting to be uncovered. She had tried to show it to her mother years ago, but had been dismissed. Was there something important about it? Something more than just decoration. The tension of the day, the unspoken criticisms, the feeling of being perpetually on trial weighed heavily on her. She missed the quiet solitude of her own studio, the freedom to create without judgment. She found Clara in the drawing room, curled up on a sofa, looking exhausted but happy. "Hey Lou," Eleanor said, sitting down beside her. "Hey Elle," Clara replied, leaning her head on Eleanor's shoulder. "Thanks for coming. It means so much." "I wouldn't miss it," Eleanor said, squeezing her sister's hand. "You happy, Lou?" Clara smiled, a soft, genuine smile. "Yeah, Elle, I am. Daniel's good, stable. He understands me. That's what matters," Eleanor said. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment. "Mom's been stressed," Clara said, her voice low. "The business hasn't been doing well. Thomas is trying his best, but—" "I know," Eleanor said softly. She had seen the worry lines on her mother's face, heard the frustration in Thomas's voice. The legacy was struggling. "She was really surprised about your business, Elle," Clara continued. "And I think maybe a little impressed. Even if she won't say it." Eleanor felt a tiny flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, her success could bridge the gap, could show them that there was more than one way to honor the Vance name. "Did you ever notice this?" Eleanor asked, holding up the porcelain robin, showing Clara the faint pattern on the base. Clara took the robin, her brow furrowing. "No, I've never looked that closely. What is it?" "I don't know," Eleanor admitted. "It's so fine, like a signature or a code." "Maybe it's just part of the design," Clara said, handing it back. "Maybe," Eleanor said, but a feeling in her gut told her it was more. It felt significant, tied to the robin's status as an heirloom. As the night deepened, the quiet of the house settled in. Eleanor lay in her childhood bed, the porcelain robin on the bedside table. The weight of the past felt heavier tonight, the future uncertain. The wedding was tomorrow, and with it, the potential for more tension, more revelations. She closed her eyes, trying to find peace in the familiar surroundings, but the ghosts of old wounds and the whispers of unspoken truths kept sleep at bay. What would you do in this situation? Drop a comment, give a like, and we'll meet again for another quiet epic. The morning of the wedding dawned gray and overcast, a mirror of the mood that had settled over the house. There was a nervous energy in the air, a mix of excitement for Clara and underlying anxiety about the day's proceedings. As the bridal party bustled about and guests began to arrive, a new, unexpected tension arose. Beatrice, usually a picture of composure, seemed pale and unsteady. She dismissed concerns with a wave of her hand, attributing it to wedding stress. But Eleanor noticed the way her mother clutched her chest occasionally, the faint tremor in her hands. During the late morning, as the photographer was attempting to gather the family for portraits, Beatrice suddenly swayed, her face paling dramatically. Clara cried out, rushing to her mother's side. "Mother? Are you all right?" Beatrice didn't answer, her eyes wide with something akin to fear. She stumbled, and Thomas reached out to steady her. "Mother, you don't look well," Thomas said, his voice laced with alarm. Beatrice took a shallow, gasping breath. "Just a little dizzy. It's nothing." But it was clearly something. Her complexion was ashen, her lips tinged blue. Before anyone could react, her eyes rolled back, and she collapsed forward, thankfully caught by Thomas before she hit the ground. Panic erupted. Clara screamed. Guests rushed forward. Eleanor, her heart pounding, pushed through the crowd. "Call an ambulance," she shouted, her voice cutting through the noise. Now, while someone fumbled for a phone, Eleanor knelt beside her mother, checking her pulse, her breathing shallow. Beatrice's face was slack, her breathing ragged. This wasn't just stress. The next hour was a blur of frantic activity. Paramedics arrived, their sirens wailing, adding another layer of urgency to the already tense atmosphere. Beatrice was carefully stretchered out of the house, the white sheets stark against the gray day. Clara, tears streaming down her face, insisted on going with her to the hospital. Thomas, looking shaken, followed them, promising to keep everyone updated. The wedding, momentarily forgotten, hung in the air. The carefully planned schedule was in tatters. Guests stood around in stunned silence, the festive mood shattered. The grand house, usually buzzing with activity, felt eerily quiet in the wake of the ambulance departure. Eleanor stood on the porch, watching the ambulance disappear down the driveway, the wail of its siren fading into the distance. A profound sense of shock had settled over her. Despite their difficult relationship, her mother was a constant, an unshakable force. To see her so vulnerable, so frail, was deeply unsettling. The porcelain robin, which she had planned to give to Clara as a wedding gift, sat on a nearby table, its delicate form a stark contrast to the sudden harsh reality they were facing. It felt insignificant now, a small piece of beauty in a moment of crisis. Thomas called a little while later. His voice was tight with stress. It's her heart, Eleanor. They think it's a stress-induced episode, maybe a minor attack. They're running tests. She's stable for now, but..." He trailed off, the unspoken fear hanging in the air. Is she awake? Can we see her?" Eleanor asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Not yet," Thomas said. "They want her to rest. They said they'll call when they know more. Clara's staying with her." "Okay," Eleanor said, feeling helpless.
What do we do?"
Thomas asked, the question directed not just at Eleanor, but at the universe. The wedding. Eleanor looked at the assembled guests, the worried faces, the ruined plans. We wait, Thomas. There's nothing else we can do right now. We wait for news about Mother." The wedding was officially postponed. Guests began to make quiet arrangements to leave, their hurried departures a stark contrast to their earlier cheerful arrivals. The house emptied, the silence returning, heavier this time, laden with worry and uncertainty. Eleanor walked back inside, the grand hall feeling vast and empty. The displays of Vance porcelain seemed to mock her now, symbols of a legacy that felt fragile, perhaps even broken. Her mother's health scare had laid bare the underlying fragility of the family, of the business, of everything they had built their identity upon. She went back to her room, the quiet echoing in her ears. She picked up the porcelain robin. Its cool, smooth surface felt grounding. She looked at the faint pattern on its base again, concentrating, trying to decipher it. Was it possible it held some key, some clue, not just about the past, but about how to navigate this uncertain future? The sudden, unexpected crisis had ripped away the pretense, the carefully constructed facades. The family's vulnerability was exposed, and in the heart of that vulnerability lay not just fear, but perhaps a grudging need for the very skills and perspective Eleanor had cultivated outside their world. The gentle unraveling had taken a sharp, frightening turn. The hours that followed Beatrice's collapse stretched into a long, anxious night. The house was shrouded in a heavy silence, broken only by the occasional creak of the old floorboards or the soft ticking of a grandfather clock in the hall. Eleanor, Thomas, and a few close family members who had stayed behind gathered in the drawing room, the atmosphere thick with unspoken worry. Phone calls to the hospital offered updates that were both reassuring and concerning. Beatrice was stable, the tests were ongoing, but her heart was weak, a clear sign that the years of stress, the burden of carrying the Vance legacy, had taken their toll. The doctors were cautiously optimistic, but the underlying message was clear. Things had to change. Eleanor sat by the fireplace, the flames casting dancing shadows on the worried faces around her. She watched Thomas pacing, his usual composure shattered. He looked lost, the weight of the business, of the family, suddenly crushing him. "I don't understand," he muttered, running a hand through his hair. She seemed fine, a little tired, maybe, but stress, Thomas. Eleanor said softly, "Running a business, carrying all that responsibility, it takes its toll." Thomas stopped pacing, looking at her. You think this is about the business?" "It's about everything, isn't it?" Eleanor replied. "The business, the legacy, the pressure to maintain it, to live up to generations of expectation." He sank into a chair, burying his face in his hands. "I can't do this alone, Eleanor. I don't know how she did it." Eleanor felt a pang of sympathy for her brother. He had taken on the mantle of responsibility willingly, perhaps even eagerly, but he hadn't anticipated the crushing weight of it or the changing landscape of the market. He was a skilled craftsman, but perhaps not a natural leader or innovator in the way the business now required. The heirloom robin sat on the mantelpiece, placed there by someone, a silent, unchanging presence in the shifting currents of family crisis. Eleanor's gaze kept returning to it, to the faint, hidden pattern on its base. It felt important, a thread connecting the past to the present. Later that night, unable to sleep, Eleanor returned to the drawing room. The house was silent now, everyone having retreated to their rooms. She picked up the porcelain robin from the mantelpiece. Holding it carefully, she examined the base again under the soft glow of a lamp. The pattern was incredibly intricate, almost invisible to the naked eye. It looked like a series of tiny, stylized symbols arranged in a circular pattern. It wasn't just a random design. It looked deliberate, like a form of inscription. But what did it say? And why was it hidden? She remembered her grandmother, a quiet woman who had spent hours in the studio, often working on delicate, intricate pieces that seemed almost magical. She had a reputation for being a little eccentric, for dabbling in things beyond just pottery. Could the pattern be something from her? Driven by a sudden intuition, Eleanor went to the small, dusty library, a room rarely used except as a repository for old books and family papers. She was looking for anything related to her grandmother, anything that might shed light on hidden symbols or unusual practices within the family's history. She searched the shelves, the air thick with the scent of aged paper and dust. She found old business ledgers, brittle newspaper clippings about Vance Porcelain's past glories, and biographies of long-dead ancestors. And then, tucked away on a high shelf, she found a small, leather-bound journal, her grandmother's name inscribed on the cover in faded ink. Alara Vance. Her heart quickened. She carried the journal back to the drawing room, the porcelain robin clutched in her other hand. She opened the journal carefully, the pages fragile with age. The writing was elegant, flowing. It chronicled her grandmother's thoughts, her inspirations, her struggles with the limitations placed upon women in the business generations ago. She read about Elara's fascination with ancient symbols, with the idea of imbuing pieces with deeper meaning, and then she found it. A passage describing a secret code, a system of symbols Elara had developed, inspired by nature and the forms she saw in the clay, a way to leave hidden messages, to express ideas that couldn't be openly shared in the restrictive environment of her time. Eleanor's hands trembled as she read on. Elara described creating a special piece, a small porcelain robin, and inscribing it with a message using her hidden code. A message for the one who would see beyond the surface. Eleanor looked at the robin in her hand, then back at the journal. The symbols Elara described matched the faint pattern on the robin's base. It was a key. She carefully deciphered the code, using the journal as a guide. The message on the robin's base was short, but profound. It read, "The strongest roots grow in unexpected soil. Let the clay remember its wild heart." The strongest roots grow in unexpected soil. Let the clay remember its wild heart. Tears welled up in Eleanor's eyes. It was a message of validation, sent across generations. Her grandmother, Elara, the quiet artist, had understood she had faced her own limitations within the tradition, and had secretly celebrated the idea of growth and innovation, of the wild heart of the clay, untamed by rigid forms. It was a message meant for her. Eleanor, who had left the expected soil of Vance porcelain to grow her own roots in the unexpected soil of the city. It was a blessing, a confirmation that her path was not a betrayal, but a fulfillment of a deeper, hidden legacy within the Vance family. A legacy of quiet rebellion, of finding strength in authenticity. Holding the robin and the journal, Eleanor felt a sense of profound connection to her grandmother, a woman she had barely known. She wasn't just the daughter who had left. She was the inheritor of Elara's quiet strength and her vision for the future of the craft. This wasn't just about her success. It was about the soul of Vance porcelain. It wasn't just about maintaining tradition. It was about allowing the clay to remember its wild heart, to embrace innovation and change while honoring its roots. Her mother's collapse, the crisis facing the business, her grandmother's hidden message. It all converged in this moment, illuminating a path forward. The night of reflection had brought not just understanding of the past, but a glimmer of hope for the future. The next day was fraught with a different kind of tension. News from the hospital was cautiously positive. Beatrice was stable and resting, but her recovery would be slow and would require significant changes to her life. Reducing stress being paramount, this meant the burden of the business and the responsibility for its future fell squarely on Thomas's shoulders and implicitly on the family as a whole. The remaining family members gathered for a somber, improvised meal. The absence of Beatrice's formidable presence hung heavy in the air. The conversation kept circling back to the business, the challenges it faced, the uncertainty of the future. Thomas, clearly overwhelmed, looked to his aunts and uncles, hoping for answers, for guidance, but they offered only platitudes and nostalgic reminiscences of the business's glory days. Eleanor listened, the porcelain robin warm in her hand, its hidden message resonating within her. She looked at Thomas, at his stressed face, at the fear in his eyes. She saw her aunts and uncles, rooted in the past, unable or unwilling to see the path forward. She saw the Vance legacy, so carefully preserved, now teetering on the brink. The quiet dinner began to unravel. An uncle, a retired businessman, cleared his throat. "Thomas, son, you've got to cut costs. Scale back. Focus on the classics. That's what people know Vance porcelain for. But sales are declining, Uncle George," Thomas said, his voice strained. "The market for traditional pieces just isn't what it was." "Then you're not marketing them right," Aunt Carol interjected, her voice sharp. "It's about quality, about heritage. People will pay for that." "They will," Eleanor said, her voice quiet but firm, cutting through the rising tension. All eyes turned to her, but they also want relevance. They want pieces that fit their lives now, not just museum pieces. Aunt Carol scoffed. "And what would you know about Vance porcelain, Eleanor? You abandoned it. The familiar accusation. The old wound flared, but this time, Eleanor didn't recoil. She met Aunt Carol's gaze steadily. I built a successful ceramics business from scratch. Aunt Carol, I understand the market. I understand design, and I understand that clinging to the past without adapting to the present is a recipe for extinction. Extinction? Thomas exclaimed, looking horrified. Look around, Thomas, Eleanor said, gesturing faintly towards the displays of porcelain in the hall. Beautiful, yes. Masterful, absolutely. But how many young people are buying these pieces? How many are even familiar with the Vance name beyond this region? We have a reputation, Uncle George sputtered. A historical one, Eleanor countered gently. History is important, but it doesn't pay the bills. My grandmother, Alara, understood this. Beatrice's younger sister, Aunt Lillian, a quiet woman who rarely spoke up, looked at Eleanor, a flicker of curiosity in her eyes. Alara, what do you mean? Eleanor held up the porcelain robin. This heirloom, my grandmother left a hidden message on its base, a message about allowing the clay to remember its wild heart, about finding strength in unexpected soil. She understood that tradition needed innovation to thrive. She explained the hidden code, the journal, the message. As she spoke, a hush fell over the table. The family members listened, some skeptical, some intrigued. Thomas looked at the robin, then at Eleanor, a flicker of understanding in his eyes. Alara was always a little unconventional, Aunt Lillian murmured, a soft smile on her face. She saw things differently. She saw the future, Eleanor said. She knew the craft had to evolve, and that's what I've done. I've taken the essence of what Vance porcelain is, the quality, the artistry, and I've applied it to contemporary design. My business is thriving because it speaks to today's consumers. She paused, taking a deep breath. This was the confrontation, not just with Aunt Carol, but with the ingrained resistance to change that permeated the family. Vance porcelain needs to do the same. It needs to remember its wild heart. It needs to innovate, to explore new forms, new markets. It needs to connect with a new generation. Are you suggesting we abandon our heritage? Thomas asked, his voice tight. No, Eleanor said firmly. I'm suggesting we honor it by allowing it to live, to breathe, to grow, not by keeping it locked away like a relic. My grandmother's message wasn't about abandoning roots, but about finding strength in new soil. My unexpected soil in the city allowed me to see this craft with fresh eyes, to understand its potential beyond the confines of tradition. The air crackled with tension. Aunt Carol looked furious. Uncle George looked bewildered. Thomas was silent, wrestling with the implications. You think you can just waltz back in here after years away and tell us how to run our business? Aunt Carol demanded, her voice rising.
I'm not telling you what to do, Eleanor said,
her voice remaining calm despite the attack. I'm sharing what I've learned, what my grandmother, Vance, understood generations ago. The craft is in my blood too. I built my business on the foundation of what I learned here, but I allowed it to evolve. Thomas finally spoke, his voice hesitant. But how? How do we just change everything? You don't change everything overnight, Eleanor said, sensing a shift, a tiny opening. You start small. You introduce new lines that blend tradition and modernity. You leverage online platforms to tell your story and reach a wider audience. You collaborate with designers who can bring fresh perspectives. She looked at Thomas, her gaze soft. You're a master craftsman, Thomas. Your skill is undeniable. Imagine combining that skill with designs that excite a new market. It's not about replacing the old. It's about expanding, about allowing the Vance legacy to grow and adapt. The confrontation had been difficult, painful even, but it had also laid everything bare. The fear, the resistance, the potential for a different future. The porcelain robin sat on the table, a small, silent witness to the storm. Its hidden message, once a secret between Eleanor and her grandmother, was now out in the open, a challenge and a promise. The family was fractured, uncertain. But for the first time, the possibility of a different path seemed to glimmer, faint but real, through the cracks. The crisis point was the business's immediate future. Beatrice's health meant she could no longer bear the weight of its operational stress. Thomas, while skilled in the studio, lacked the business acumen and the vision needed to navigate the challenging market. The traditional approach was failing, and the family, reeling from Beatrice's collapse and the uncomfortable truths laid bare during the confrontation, was paralyzed by uncertainty. A meeting was called, not a formal board meeting, but a gathering of the core family members who had a stake in Vance Porcelain. The atmosphere was heavy, tinged with fear and desperation. Thomas, looking haggard, laid out the stark reality. Sales were down, costs were rising, and without a significant shift in strategy, the business was facing serious financial difficulties. Uncle George and Aunt Carol reiterated their calls to cut back, to shrink, to focus on a niche market, essentially allowing the legacy to slowly fade into a smaller, less relevant entity. Their fear of change was palpable. Thomas looked at Eleanor, a silent question in his eyes. Eleanor held the porcelain robin, its cool weight, a comfort. She had spent the morning looking at the business's financials, at the market trends, at the potential she saw. "There's another way," she said, her voice clear and steady. All eyes turned to her. "We don't have to shrink. We can grow. We can leverage the incredible heritage and skill of Vance Porcelain and infuse it with new life." She laid out her proposal. It wasn't about abandoning tradition, but about building upon it. She proposed creating a new line, a Lara collection, inspired by her grandmother's spirit and featuring contemporary designs that blended classic Vance techniques with modern aesthetics. She outlined a comprehensive digital marketing strategy, focusing on storytelling, community building, and e-commerce expansion. She suggested collaborating with emerging artists and designers, bringing fresh perspectives into the studio. She spoke with passion and authority, drawing on her years of experience building Ember and Clay. She presented market research, sales projections, a clear roadmap for revitalizing the business. She wasn't just offering ideas, she was offering a proven strategy. Silence followed her presentation. The family members exchanged glances, their faces a mixture of surprise, skepticism, and grudging respect. "But that's not how Vance Porcelain operates," Uncle George said, his voice hesitant. "It's how a successful business operates in today's world," Eleanor countered gently. "We can honor the legacy by ensuring it has a future, by allowing it to adapt and thrive." Thomas spoke, his voice quiet. "It's a lot, a complete shift." "It is," Eleanor acknowledged. "But the alternative is watching everything mother and generations before her built slowly fade away." Aunt Lillian, the quiet one, spoke up. "Laura would have loved this, Eleanor. She always dreamed of the studio embracing new ideas." This simple statement, linking Eleanor's vision to a beloved ancestor, seemed to break through some of the resistance. "But who would lead this?" Aunt Carol asked, her tone still skeptical. "Thomas is needed in the studio, and Beatrice..." "Well," Eleanor looked at Thomas. "I would. I've built a successful business doing exactly this. I understand the design, the marketing, the operations. I can lead the transition, work with Thomas in the studio, develop the new lines, build the online presence." Thomas looked stunned. You'd come back? After everything?" "This isn't about coming back to the past, Thomas," Eleanor said, her voice soft. "It's about building a future for the business, for the family. My grandmother's message was about unexpected soil. My time away, building Ember and Clay, was that unexpected soil. It gave me the tools and the perspective to help Vance Porcelain remember its wild heart." And Carl was still resistant, but her voice lacked its earlier sharpness. "But your own business, Ember and Clay, what about that?" "Ember and Clay will continue," Eleanor said. It's a separate entity, but its success is built on the same principles of innovation and quality that can revitalize Vance Porcelain. I can manage both, especially during this transition. The room was quiet again, the weight of the decision pressing down on them. Thomas looked from Eleanor to the other family members, then back to Eleanor. He saw not the rebellious sister who had left, but the capable, successful businesswoman who held a vision for the future. He saw hope where before there had only been despair. "I can't do this alone," Thomas said, his voice low, acknowledging his limitations. He looked at Eleanor. Can you really do this, El?" "I can," Eleanor said, meeting his gaze. "We can, Thomas. Together, honoring the past, building the future." It wasn't a unanimous decision. There were still doubts and reservations etched on some faces, but the urgency of the situation and the clear, viable path Eleanor presented swayed the balance. Thomas, with a nod that felt like a seismic shift, agreed. The family, albeit reluctantly for some, gave their hesitant assent. The power had shifted, not through a forceful takeover, but through a demonstration of capability and a vision rooted in both tradition and innovation. Eleanor, the daughter who had left, was now the one guiding the future of Vance Porcelain. The porcelain robin, held tight in her hand, felt not like a chain but like a key. Its hidden message had led her back, not to reclaim the past, but to redeem it. 1 year later, the scent of damp clay still hangs in the air of the Vance Porcelain studio, but now it's mingled with the fresh scent of new glazes and the faint hum of computers. The changes weren't easy. There were initial hurdles, resistance from some of the older studio staff, and the immense task of integrating new processes and designs into a century-old operation. But under Eleanor's quiet, capable leadership, things began to shift. The Alara collection launched to critical acclaim, its elegant, contemporary forms resonating with a new generation of consumers. The online store, revamped and visually stunning, showcased not just the products, but the story behind them, the history, the artistry, the blend of tradition and innovation. Social media campaigns brought the Vance name to a wider audience, highlighting the skilled hands that shaped the clay, the intricate process of firing, the inspiration behind each piece. Thomas, initially hesitant, had embraced the changes. He worked closely with Eleanor on the new designs, his masterful technical skill complementing her vision. He found a renewed passion for the craft, excited by the challenge of creating new forms and experimenting with new techniques. His stress levels, while not entirely gone, were significantly reduced. He was no longer solely responsible for the daunting task of keeping the business afloat. He was a partner in its revitalization. Beatrice, recovering slowly, had initially viewed the changes with skepticism. But as she saw the positive impact, the renewed energy in the studio, the positive press, and the growing sales figures, her resistance softened. She spent more time in the studio, not overseeing with a critical eye, but watching with a quiet pride, sometimes offering a gentle suggestion or sharing a forgotten technique. She even allowed a few pieces from the Alara collection to be displayed in the Grand Hall, a small but significant gesture of acceptance. Clara and Daniel were happily married, their wedding rescheduled, a joyful occasion that marked a new beginning for the family. Clara continued to work in the studio, finding her place in the blending of old and new techniques, her gentle nature a soothing presence amidst the changes. Eleanor had found a balance between running Ember and Clay and guiding Vance Porcelain. Her city studio remained her base, but she spent several days a week at the estate, working alongside Thomas, mentoring the staff, overseeing the strategic direction. It wasn't always easy. The demands were high, but the work was fulfilling. She was using all of her skills, her passion for the craft, her business acumen, to revitalize a legacy that was deeply ingrained in her. The family dynamics had shifted. The deep-seated resentments and misunderstandings hadn't vanished overnight, but they had softened. The crisis had forced them to confront their vulnerabilities and their interdependence. The shared goal of saving Vance Porcelain and Beatrice's health scare had created a space for forgiveness, for understanding. Eleanor's relationship with her mother was still complex, but there was a new layer of respect. Beatrice acknowledged Eleanor's capabilities, her vision, her success. The grudging admiration had grown into something closer to pride. They could finally talk about the business, about the future, without the weight of past grievances crushing the conversation. The porcelain robin sat on Eleanor's desk at the estate, a symbol of the journey. It represented the past, the heirloom tradition. But now, with its hidden message understood and embraced, it also represented the future, the potential for growth and renewal. Eleanor looked out the studio window. The familiar rolling hills bathed in the soft afternoon light. She had left this place carrying a heavy burden of rejection and disappointment. She had returned carrying the weight of her own success and a vision for the future. The unexpected soil of her life, a way, had indeed allowed her roots to grow strong enough to help anchor the Vance legacy and guide it towards a new dawn. The gentle unraveling had led not to breakage, but to a mending, a strengthening, a beautiful refiring of family and legacy. What would you do in this situation? Give a like and let us know in the comments. Eleanor sat on the porch swing, the late afternoon sun warming her face. The sound of distant laughter from the studio, the rhythmic turning of a potter's wheel, drifted on the air. It was the sound of Vance porcelain, alive and thriving, the echoes of the past harmonizing with the energy of the present. She thought back to the day she received Clara's wedding invitation, the dread that had settled in her stomach, the fear of returning to the place of her deepest wound. She had come back for Clara, but she had found so much more. She had found a way to reconcile with her past, to understand her mother's fears and her brother's struggles, and to use the strength she had built away from home to help heal the very family that had, in many ways, broken her heart. The heirloom porcelain robin rested in her lap, its cool surface smooth beneath her fingers. Its hidden message: the strongest roots grow in unexpected soil. Let the clay remember its wild heart, felt like a guiding principle, a quiet affirmation of her journey. Her grandmother, Alara, had left a legacy not just of beautiful porcelain, but of quiet wisdom and a deep understanding of the need for evolution, forgiveness. It wasn't a grand, dramatic event, but a gradual process, like the slow cooling of a kiln. It was in the shared moments in the studio, the hesitant smiles, the quiet conversations, the mutual effort to build something new from the remnants of the old. It was in seeing her mother's relief, Thomas's newfound confidence, Clara's quiet happiness. It was in allowing herself to let go of the anger, the bitterness, the need for validation. She had validated herself through her work, through her resilience. This story isn't just about a family business or a return home. It's about the complex, often painful threads that tie us to our families, to our pasts. It's about the courage it takes to leave, to build your own life, and the different kind of courage it takes to return, not as a vanquished child, but as an adult with something valuable to offer. It makes you wonder, doesn't it? How much of who we are is shaped by the expectations placed upon us, and how much by the paths we forge for ourselves, even when those paths take us far from where we thought we belonged. What happens when the legacy we inherit feels like a burden, and the future we build feels like a betrayal? Is it possible to weave the two together, to honor where we came from while embracing where we are meant to go? Eleanor didn't have all the answers, but sitting on the porch swing, the robin in her hand, the sounds of a revitalized Vance porcelain filling the air, she knew she had found a way to be both the daughter of Vance porcelain and the founder of Ember and Clay. She was the unexpected soil and the wild heart helping the ancient roots find new ground.